Shadow Eater, a void-ronin, and a silk-bat shatter. A Shogun's Mirror Empire to Free the Faceless. Chapter 1. The air in the Mirror Glass Valley tasted of static and regret. It clung to the throat, a gritty film of pulverized obsidian and the ghosts of 1,000 lost reflections. The sun, a malevolent white splinter, sliced through the landscape with brutal precision, illuminating the impossible geometry of the valley, a vast curving bowl, lined with towering walls of polished obsidian, each reflecting a distorted, warped version of the other. The silence was not peaceful. It was a suffocating pressure, punctuated only by the rhythmic, hypnotic rasp of thousands of men meticulously polishing the glass, the endless, agonizing task ordained by the Refraction Shogun. I was Kuro, though Kuro felt like a borrowed name, a whispered rumor rather than a declaration. I was a shadow, a space where shadow should not be, a void given form. My kimono, once indigo silk, was now the color of a starless night, absorbing what little light dared penetrate the oppressive glare. The seams were frayed, etched with the subtle shimmer of solidified darkness, the residue of a bargain struck with a demon of the Total Eclipse. I had arrived 3 days ago, drawn to this valley by a psychic echo, a chorus of stolen faces screaming silently for release. The valley itself was a wound upon the land, a testament to the Shogun's depravity. He ruled not through force, but through a chillingly elegant form of manipulation. He possessed the Prismatic-Slavery, a terrifying technology that extracted the reflections of living beings, trapping them within the obsidian walls as mindless servants. The villagers, stripped of their identity, their very sense of self, were reduced to polished surfaces, endlessly buffing the Shogun's obsessive collection of stolen beauty. I'd been a ronin for 15 years, a ghost in the armor of fallen clans. Honor, once a burning coal within me, had long since been quenched. After the massacre at the Crimson Falls, after the betrayal by a lord who valued silk over loyalty, ID simply vanished, seeking oblivion in the furthest corners of the empire. The Eclipse demon, a being of pure negation, found me, sensed the emptiness ID cultivated, and offered a solution, a way to become nothing, to erase myself completely. The price, my reflection. Now, standing on a ridge overlooking the valley, I observed the ceaseless activity below. The mirror guards, the Shogun's elite warriors, were a spectacle of manufactured terror. They wore armor crafted from diamond glass, each plate a miniature, hyper-reflective lens that could focus and amplify sunlight into a lethal beam. Their movements were precise, deadly, a testament to the Shogun's control. ID already witnessed one attempt to capture me, a volley of solar beams that, impossibly, seemed to dissipate before impacting my skin. I hadn't burned, hadn't even felt the heat. ID simply absorbed it. That's when I saw her. She was hanging from the hilt of Void-Sheath, my katana a weapon forged from solidified dark matter, an object that defied reflection entirely. She was small, no bigger than a clenched fist, with wings of translucent silk that shimmered with 1,000 captured reflections. Her eyes, though, were what truly captivated me, violet amethyst, pulsing with a strange internal light. She was a refraction-ghost, a fragment of shattered beauty, a spirit born from the stolen reflections of the Shogun's prison. I named her Luna. Luna wasn't a warrior. She was a distortion, a bending of light. While I was the void that swallowed the illumination, she was the prism that fractured and redirected it. She seemed to sense my purpose, a faint, fluttering excitement in her violet eyes. "You shouldn't be here, Kuro," she whispered, her voice a delicate chime, barely audible above the drone of the polishing men. "This place, it resists change. It thrives on stillness." "Stillness is a death sentence," I replied, my voice a rasp, a sound akin to the grinding of ancient stone. I activated Void-Sheath. The air around the blade seemed to thin, to darken. The katana appeared less like a weapon, and more like a hole in the fabric of reality. "Then let us create chaos," I said, drawing the blade. The reflection of the valley vanished from its surface, swallowed by the absolute darkness. The first mirror guard, a towering figure clad in armor that reflected the jagged sunlight like 1,000 burning eyes, moved to intercept. He raised his arm, preparing to unleash a beam of concentrated solar energy. I didn't flinch. I didn't even acknowledge him. I simply extended my hand, and the darkness from Void-Sheath enveloped the guard, expanding outwards, creating a localized zone of absolute night. The beam, meant to incinerate, simply ceased to exist within my shadow. The guard, blinded, panicked, and before he could recover, I moved, a silent, swift dance of darkness, and severed his arm a clean, precise cut through diamond glass, leaving behind a smear of glittering sand. Luna fluttered around me, a frantic, beautiful whirlwind. You're eating their light," she cried, her violet eyes wide with wonder and a touch of fear. I didn't respond. I was focused, calculating, moving through the valley like a nightmare. The mirror guards, overwhelmed by the sudden, inexplicable disappearances of light and the unnerving efficiency of my movements, began to break ranks, their polished armor useless against the consuming darkness. This was only the beginning. The Shogun's mirror empire was about to shatter. Chapter 2. Echoes in Obsidian. The air in the Mirror Glass Valley hung thick with the scent of ozone and pulverized diamond. The silence, once a weapon of oppressive serenity, now pulsed with the ragged breaths of the panicked mirror guards. They were a storm of shattered reflections, their movements jerky, desperate, their diamond glass armor chipped and bleeding light a dangerous, erratic glitter that Kuro actively sought out. Luna, a frantic smudge of violet against the oppressive gray, was a vital component of his strategy. She wasn't a warrior, she was a resonator, a key to unlocking the fundamental instability of the Shogun's creations. Kuro had observed, during his initial assessment, that the diamond glass wasn't merely reflective, it was fundamentally sensitive to light, vibrating at a specific frequency dictated by the stolen reflections contained within. He moved with a chilling grace, a phantom in the gloom. He wasn't seeking glory, nor vengeance, but a slow, deliberate unraveling. A mirror guard, a hulking figure named Kaito, recovered his senses, clutching at a severed limb, a swirling vortex of fractured reflection radiating outwards. Kuro didn't hesitate. He extended Void-Sheath, and the blade plunged into Kaito's chest, a line of absolute darkness that seemed to drain the very color from the air. Kaito didn't scream, he simply ceased to be, a momentary flicker of 1,000 borrowed faces swallowed by the blade. Luna shrieked a high-pitched trill, her silk wings vibrating with a frequency that intensified the vibrations within the remaining armor. Kuro channeled his focus, pushing the darkness further, creating a localized void storm around Kaito's corpse. The remaining shards of diamond glass, responding to Luna's amplified resonance, began to vibrate violently, shattering into a blizzard of glittering dust. The process was mesmerizing, almost beautiful in its destructive efficiency. "It's exquisite," Luna whispered, her violet eyes fixated on the cascade of broken reflections. "Like a shattered dream." Kuro acknowledged her with a barely perceptible nod. He wasn't driven by aesthetic appreciation, he recognized it as a critical element. The more he disrupted the reflections, the more unstable the Shogun's constructs became. He moved towards a group of guards attempting to form a defensive perimeter, their diamond glass shields reflecting the meager light like 1,000 malevolent eyes. "Hold," he commanded, his voice a low, rasping murmur that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. It wasn't a command of authority, but an assertion of a presence far older, far colder than any human warrior. The guards, already disoriented and terrified, hesitated. Kuro didn't press the darkness, instead he used Luna. She flew directly towards the center of their formation, spiraling through the chaos, her wings generating a sonic pulse that targeted the resonant frequencies of their armor. The effect was immediate. The diamond glass plates began to crack, not with a violent shattering, but with a slow, insidious disintegration, as if the very material was dissolving under a sustained, violet-tinged pressure. One by one, the guards collapsed, their armor transforming into useless piles of glittering dust. Kuro moved in, a whirlwind of shadow and steel, each cut a precise, brutal execution. He didn't engage in prolonged combat. He was a surgical strike, removing the threat with chilling efficiency. As the last of the mirror guards fell, Kuro turned his attention to the main gate, the Diamond Gate, an archway constructed entirely of colossal, perfectly polished diamond glass, a testament to the Shogun's obsession with perfection and control. The gate was guarded by a single, formidable figure, a veteran mirror guard, his armor scarred and dented, his movements surprisingly agile. This warrior, named Ren, seemed immune to the initial assaults. He wielded a spear tipped with a focusing crystal, channeling concentrated solar energy into a narrow beam aimed directly at Kuro. This wasn't the blind panic of the others. Ren fought with a desperate, almost suicidal precision, anticipating Kuro's movements, attempting to force a direct confrontation. "You cannot evade the truth," Ren shouted, his voice distorted by the amplifying crystal. "Light will always conquer darkness." Kuro didn't respond to the taunt. He simply expanded his silhouette, creating a deeper, more profound zone of darkness, a pocket of absolute night that seemed to devour the very sunlight. The solar beam struck, not with a blinding flash, but with a slow, agonizing absorption. The light didn't burn, it vanished, pulled into the heart of Kuro's being. Luna, sensing the shift in power, unleashed a torrent of violet energy, guiding Kuro through a complex, three-dimensional weave. He moved around Ren, a ghost slipping through a maze, and with a single decisive stroke severed Ren's spear arm at joint. The final act wasn't a dramatic explosion or a shattering blow, but a quiet, unnerving cessation. Ren slumped to the ground, his armor still reflecting the light, but utterly powerless. "The mirror reflects only what is desired," Kuro said, his voice devoid of emotion, not what is. He looked towards the Diamond Gate, now fractured and scarred, a gaping maw in the obsidian facade of the Shogun's fortress. And soon, it will reflect nothing at all. Chapter 3. The echo of absence. The air in the shattered halls of the Mirror Glass Valley hung thick with the scent of ozone and pulverized obsidian. The silence, once a sterile, oppressive blanket, now throbbed with a fractured resonance, like a shattered bell perpetually ringing a single mournful note. The midday sun, a weak and hesitant presence, struggled to penetrate the jagged rents in the fortress walls, casting elongated, distorted shadows that danced with a desperate, almost mocking fluidity. Kuro, a study in grayscale against the chaos, moved with an unsettling grace. He wasn't running. Not exactly. He dissolved into the dark spaces created by the broken glass, a ripple in the fabric of reality. Luna, clinging to his katana's hilt, pulsed with a faint violet luminescence, her silk wings stirring silently, mapping the newly exposed contours of the Shogun's fractured domain. Ren lay a few meters away, his shattered spear arm a gruesome monument to the futility of direct confrontation. The diamond glass armor, once a symbol of impenetrable defense, now shimmered with a dull, defeated gleam, reflecting only fragmented glimpses of the carnage. He wasn't dead. The solar flare hadn't touched him. Instead, he existed in a state of suspended animation, a trapped echo of aggressive intent. His mind, fragmented by the violet wave Luna unleashed, cycled through the same desperate justifications, the same futile pronouncements of light conquering darkness. It was a horrifying testament to the Shogun's power not to destroy, but to distort and imprison. Kuro ignored him. He was charting a course, guided by Luna's frantic pulses, towards the heart of the fortress, the obsidian core, the central chamber where the master mirror resided. The shard of solidified dark matter that was Void-Sheath felt strangely warm against his skin, a perverse comfort in this landscape of stolen beauty. "The echoes grow stronger," Luna whispered, her violet eyes widening. "The reflections, they resist. They attempt to reassemble themselves." Kuro didn't acknowledge the growing pressure. He approached the diamond gate, now a jagged, teeth-like maw in the fortress fade. The remaining mirror guards, a dozen in number, were arrayed before it, their diamond glass armor reflecting the fractured sunlight in a blinding kaleidoscope of terror. They hadn't moved, hadn't attacked. They were locked in a static, horrified dance, paralyzed by the sheer absence that Kuro represented. He didn't need to fight them. He simply was. Drawing Void-Sheath, he raised the katana. The blade didn't reflect. It wasn't a weapon of aggression. It was an instrument of subtraction. Kuro didn't attack. He began to erase. With each slow, deliberate movement, he expanded his silhouette, not with the frantic absorption of the solar beam, but with a chilling, deliberate removal of the light. It wasn't about consuming energy, it was about nullifying existence. The mirror guards, bathed in the intensified glare, began to fade, not as flames, but as memories. Their reflections, their armor, their very identities, dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind only empty, dust-covered plates of diamond glass. Luna, anticipating this, danced a frantic, spiraling pattern, her violet energy weaving a complex net around the vanishing warriors. Each fading form released a final, desperate shimmer, a ghost of their purpose, a fleeting echo of their conviction. "They were not soldiers," Kuro said, his voice a low, mournful hum that seemed to vibrate through the obsidian walls. "They were reflections of a choice to cling to light, even in the face of oblivion." He reached the diamond gate, a gaping wound in the fortress defense. Beyond lay the Hall of Infinite Egos, a chamber said to be filled with the fragmented consciousnesses of those who had been stolen. A swirling vortex of faces, each screaming silently for recognition. The chamber was exactly as the legends described, a vast, circular space dominated by the master mirror. It wasn't a polished surface reflecting beauty. It was a fractured, chaotic mosaic of stolen faces, each screaming with a silent, desperate yearning. The air within shimmered with a nauseating, disorienting heat. In the center of the hall, the Shogun stood. No longer a man of terrifying power, he was a husk, a collection of mismatched reflections held together by fading enchantments. His skin pulsed with a sickly, iridescent glow, the borrowed faces twisting and shifting with grotesque mockery. He raised his hand, attempting to summon another solar flare, but his power had dwindled, diminished by Kuro's systematic erasure. "You cannot stop the inevitable," the Shogun rasped, his voice a fractured chorus of stolen voices. "Light will prevail." Kuro lowered Void-Sheath. He didn't attack. He simply stared. "You are merely a collection of borrowed perceptions," Kuro said, his voice gaining a chilling, unwavering resolve. "A desperate attempt to define yourself by what you take. And in taking, you have destroyed everything." He activated the event horizon. Not a forceful plunge, but a gentle, almost reverent slide, his hand entering the master mirror, not to consume, but to release. The darkness from Void-Sheath flowed outwards, not as a destructive force, but as a cleansing tide. The screams of the stolen reflections ceased. The chaotic mosaic of faces smoothed, coalescing into a single, sorrowful expression, a reflection of a forgotten beauty, a lost potential. The Shogun withered, dissolving into a pile of gray glass, leaving behind only the faint scent of regret. Luna, exhausted, settled onto Kuro's shoulder, her violet eyes dimming. "It is quiet," she whispered. Kuro looked out at the shattered valley, at the returning faces of the villagers, at the slowly fading remnants of the Shogun's empire. He was still a void, a silhouette of absolute darkness, but he was no longer just a shadow eater. He was the echo of absence, the promise of something new. And he knew, with a certainty born of utter desolation, that his work was far from finished. Chapter 4. The Obsidian Bloom. The returning faces of the villagers were not joyful, not immediately. They stared, blinking in the returning light, at the scene of devastation, at the skeletal remains of the Shogun's fortress, at Kuro, the unsettling figure of absolute darkness. There was a profound, unsettling quiet, broken only by the drip of water from shattered obsidian and the gentle flutter of Luna's wings. The Shogun's demise hadn't produced a triumphant dawn, but a bruised dusk. The air tasted of ash and something subtly metallic, the residue of shattered light and stolen souls. Kuro, aware of their apprehension, moved with a deliberate grace, a silent sculptor shaping the aftermath. He gathered shards of the diamond glass armor. Not to destroy them further, they were already dust, but to arrange them in a spiral around the base of a towering, petrified cherry tree, a morbid offering to a fallen empire. "Observe," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection yet carrying a palpable weight. He didn't address the villagers directly, but seemed to speak to the very stone and shadow of the valley. Light demands reflection. Reflection demands a vessel. This was the vessel's ultimate obsession. A young woman, Hana, a weaver known for her intricate silk tapestries, stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. She was one of the first to have their reflections stolen, a silent ghost working the Shogun's looms, her spirit suffocated by the forced repetition. What do you intend to do with this?" she asked, her voice tentative. Kuro turned his attention to her, a subtle shift in his form, a momentary deepening of the void where his face should have been. "I intend to seed," he replied simply. "The valley was robbed of its essence, its potential. We will rebuild, not with reflection, but with shadow." He began to work, drawing the darkness from Void-Sheath, not to consume, but to manipulate. It wasn't the destructive force of the event horizon. This was something different. He wove the darkness into the ground, into the shattered stone, creating intricate patterns that resembled blooming flowers, obsidian blossoms pulsating with an unnatural internal light. These were not flowers of life, but of absence, of the void. "The mirror guards sought to impose order," Kuro explained, his words a detached observation. "They believed in the illusion of control. I offer something more honest, the acceptance of what is." As the obsidian blooms spread, a curious thing began to happen. The villagers, initially paralyzed by fear, began to approach them. They reached out, tentatively, to touch the cool, smooth surfaces of the blossoms. And as they did, a faint, shimmering heat emanated from them, a warmth born not of light, but of the profound absence of it. The effect was subtle, but undeniable. Hana, the weaver, was the first to articulate it. I remember," she whispered, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. "I remember the feeling of my own hand, the texture of the silk beneath my fingers. The Shogun stole more than just our reflections, he stole our memories, our sensations. This is returning them." Kuro watched, a flicker of something akin to curiosity within his void. Luna, perched on his shoulder, emitted a series of rapid, melodic vibrations, as if analyzing the phenomenon. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the valley. Not a destructive quake, but a rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. From the heart of the largest obsidian bloom, a single, perfect violet crystal began to grow, radiating a soft, pulsating light. It wasn't the blinding light of the Shogun's solar beams, but a gentle, soothing luminescence. The Mirror Glass Valley was not a natural formation, Kuro announced, his voice gaining a new urgency. It was constructed by the Shogun to amplify his own vanity, to trap and distort the very essence of reality. The crystal pulsed brighter. As it did, spectral figures began to materialize around the valley. Not the distorted reflections of the villagers, but fragments of their true selves. Children laughing, lovers embracing, artists creating, all erased by the Shogun's regime, now briefly, painfully reassembling. The Shogun's empire wasn't built on power, but on the eradication of self, Kuro continued, his voice rising slightly. This crystal, it is a seed of recovery, but it needs nurturing. It needs darkness. He raised Void-Sheath, not to attack, but to offer. The blade's shadow flowed outwards, enveloping the violet crystal, becoming one with it. The obsidian blooms pulsed with a renewed intensity, feeding the crystal's growth. You will not find salvation in light, warriors, Kuro said, his voice now a low, resonant echo. Salvation lies in the acceptance of the void, the understanding that absence can be just as powerful as presence. The void is not an enemy, but a canvas, a space to rebuild. As the final shimmering reflection solidified, a single perfect obsidian blossom floated upwards and landed gently on Kuro's outstretched hand. He looked at it, and for a moment, a sliver of something like recognition, like grief, passed through his void. Then, he simply closed his hand, crushing the blossom into nothingness. Chapter 5. The Echo of Bloom. The silence after the blossom's annihilation was heavier than the obsidian dust clinging to Kuro's warm kimono. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the jagged sunlight now fractured into 1,000 bruised hues, no longer a weapon, but a mournful wash. The villagers, blinking in the returning light, were a chaotic tapestry of bewildered faces, their features slowly resolving into coherent expressions of shock, relief, and nascent hope. They were no longer shadows. A few tentatively reached out, touching the rough stone of the fortress walls, the cool damp earth beneath their feet. Children, released from the oppressive stillness, began to giggle, chasing after startled birds. The air, once sterile and oppressive, began to carry the scent of rain and something else, a faint, metallic tang, the residue of shattered diamond glass. Among the villagers, a figure emerged, a young woman, perhaps 20, clad in the faded remnants of a merchant's tunic. She carried a small, battered wooden flute, and, with hesitant movements, began to play. The melody was simple, mournful, yet laced with an undeniable yearning. It was a lament for lost faces, for stolen dreams. Kuro, standing silently amidst the wreckage, watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in the depths of his void. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl ripped through the tentative joy. From the heart of the fortress, a single mirror guard, its diamond glass armor cracked and stained with black ichor, stumbled out. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if its reflection, the core of its being, was struggling to reassert itself. It gripped a shattered shard of the master mirror, its face a mask of horrified confusion. The nothingness it choked, its voice a distorted echo of the Shogun's arrogance. It consumes it, erases it, lunged at Kuro, a desperate, futile attack fueled by the last vestiges of its programmed loyalty. Kuro didn't raise Void-Sheath. He didn't move. He simply was. The guard's blade, a blur of reflected violence, met only the consuming darkness. The impact, instead of searing, dissolved into a silent ripple, pulling the guard into a miniature vortex of absolute black. He was gone, not destroyed, but reintegrated. Another fragment of self returned to the chaotic ebb and flow of the valley. Luna, sensing the shift, emitted a series of rapid, high-pitched trills, her violet eyes blazing with an intensity that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the returning sunlight. She spiraled around Kuro, a living prism, amplifying the faint violet luminescence of the crystal, which, now fully saturated with the essence of the void, pulsed with a rhythmic beat. "The resistance is fragmented," Kuro observed, his voice a barely perceptible whisper. "They are echoes, remnants. They crave definition, shape. They are drawn to the light." He turned his gaze to the young woman playing the flute. She stopped, sensing his presence. Her eyes, wide with apprehension, met his. He didn't offer reassurance, only a silent acknowledgement of her pain, her hope, her struggle to reclaim her identity. "The crystal is a mirror, but not a passive one," he explained, his voice gaining a measured cadence. "It reflects intent. It responds to the desire for wholeness. We must guide this desire, shape it, lest it consume everything." He gestured to the crystal. "The darkness doesn't destroy. It rewrites. It doesn't erase. It offers a different perspective." Suddenly, a swirling mass of shadow coalesced around the crystal, not driven by Kuro's volition, but by the collective yearning of the returning villagers. The violet luminescence intensified, bathing the valley in an ethereal glow. Faces began to appear within the shadow faces of warriors, artists, mothers, fathers, children, not perfectly formed, but fractured, incomplete, yet undeniably real. They were born of the void, nurtured by the crystal's nascent power. But with the emergence of these new forms came a terrifying realization. The faces weren't simply present. They were hungry. They reached out with shadowy limbs, attempting to grasp at the villagers, to pull them into their fractured realities. The villagers recoiled, screaming in terror, their newly regained senses overwhelmed by the overwhelming force of this nascent, uncontrolled creation. Kuro understood. "The Shogun didn't just steal reflections," he said, his voice gaining an urgent edge. "He stole potential. He twisted it into a weapon of self-destruction. He raised Void-Sheath, not defensively, but deliberately. We must offer a counter-narrative," he instructed Luna, who swooped down and landed on the hilt of the blade. "A narrative of acceptance, of surrender to the void. We must show them that true wholeness isn't found in a fixed image, but in the dance between light and shadow, existence and nothingness." With a slow, deliberate movement, Kuro plunged Void-Sheath into the pulsing heart of the crystal. The violet light exploded outwards, not in a destructive burst, but in a wave of pure, unadulterated darkness. The shadowy faces within the crystal began to dissipate, their frantic reaching fading into serene stillness. The crystal, now completely saturated with the void, stabilized, its rhythmic pulse growing stronger, calmer. The violet glow softened, returning the valley to a state of muted twilight. The villagers, drained and shaken, watched, a palpable sense of awe replacing their initial terror. The echo of bloom, the shattered blossom, lingered in the air, a potent reminder of the price of creation, the profound beauty and terrifying power of the void. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Stillness. The twilight in the mirror-glass valley deepened, settling like a bruised plum over the shattered remains of the Shogun's fortress. The air hung thick with the scent of ozone and pulverized obsidian, a strange metallic perfume born of broken reflections and the encroaching void. The villagers, still pale and trembling, remained clustered around Kuro and Luna, a silent audience to a transformation that felt both ancient and utterly alien. They hadn't spoken since the violet explosion, their faces etched with a haunting mixture of terror and an unsettling serenity. Kuro, his form now almost entirely consumed by the dark, stood motionless, a silhouette against the fading light. Luna, her amethyst eyes burning with an intensified violet glow, fluttered around him, a tiny, frantic beacon in the deepening gloom. The Void-Sheath, normally a slick obsidian surface, seemed to shimmer with trapped shadows, subtly shifting and rearranging themselves like miniature storms. "It is done," Kuro finally rasped, the words sounding impossibly distant, as if originating from a place beyond the confines of their reality. "The Shogun's influence, it has been absorbed. The stolen potential returned." A tentative movement rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman, her face still bearing the faint tracery of the stolen smile Shed once possessed, stepped forward, her hand outstretched towards the shimmering remains of the crystal. As her fingers brushed against the cool obsidian fragments, a gasp escaped her lips. I remember," she whispered, her voice shaky with disbelief. "The scent of my husband's sake. The warmth of my daughter's hand. Things I thought lost forever." Other villagers followed suit, reaching out to touch the broken crystal, experiencing fragmented flashes of memory, a forgotten lullaby, a shared laugh, the comforting weight of a loved one's hand. The violet glow emanating from the valley, no longer a violent surge of negation, settled into a gentle, pulsing rhythm, like a heartbeat. The stolen reflections weren't gone. Exactly, they were merely present, woven into the very fabric of the villagers' newly reclaimed identities. But the experience had a peculiar side effect. As the memories returned, so too did a profound sense of stillness, a quietude that threatened to swallow all emotion. The villagers didn't scream or recoil this time. Instead, they simply were. Their expressions were blank, devoid of fear or excitement, focused solely on a gentle, inward contemplation. Kuro observed this with a grim understanding. "The Shogun didn't simply steal reflections, he stole passion," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. He traded vibrancy for a counterfeit serenity, a hollow imitation of life. The void is not about extinguishing light, but about revealing the true nature of things, the constant flux, the inherent beauty in decay and rebirth. He turned his gaze towards Luna, who was circling him with a rhythmic grace, her violet wings absorbing and dispersing the remaining ambient light. "Luna," he commanded, his voice gaining a hint of command, "teach them to feel again. Remind them of the exquisite agony of loss, the burning joy of connection. We cannot simply restore their memories, we must ignite the fires within." Luna responded by performing a series of intricate maneuvers, weaving through the air, creating miniature vortexes of violet light. These weren't violent attacks, they were focused, delicate pulses of energy directed at the villagers. Initially, nothing happened. Then, a young boy, no older than 8, stumbled. He cried out a small, involuntary wail of pain. Suddenly, a faint blush rose on his cheeks. He began to sob, a torrent of grief washing over him as he remembered his younger sister, lost to a fever last winter. The violet pulse had reminded him not just of her memory, but of the unbearable ache of her absence. Others followed suit. A farmer wept over the loss of his harvest. A woman mourned the death of her husband. But these weren't agonizing, debilitating sorrows. They were contained, controlled, as if the villagers were experiencing the emotions not as a wild, overwhelming force, but as a precisely calibrated dose of something inevitable. Kuro realized, with a chilling certainty, that Luna was not merely awakening memory, she was sculpting emotion itself. The violet light wasn't just a catalyst, it was a tool, shaping the very architecture of their feelings. "She is weaving a new kind of reflection," he murmured, his voice laced with a profound sadness, one built not on joy or sorrow, but on a profound, unsettling acceptance of nothingness, a reflection of perfect, tranquil stillness. He raised Void-Sheath, not in attack, but in a gesture of finality. The blade began to rotate slowly, emitting a faint, violet hum, a counterpoint to Luna's rhythmic dance. "The echoes," he said, his voice finally regaining its urgency, "are not just of the past. They are of potential futures, a future where feeling is a disease, and the only cure is the void." With a swift, decisive movement, he plunged Void-Sheath into the center of the gathered villagers. The violet light flared one last time, not as an explosion, but as a gentle, encompassing wave of darkness. This time, it didn't erase, it restored. Restored the ability to truly feel, to truly live, to truly suffer. The stillness fractured. The villagers cried out, not in terror, but in a raw, visceral release. They wept, they raged, they laughed, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of human emotion echoing through the shattered valley. The violet glow faded, leaving behind not an oppressive calm, but a bittersweet acknowledgement of their near-death experience. Kuro, his form now completely enveloped in shadow, turned and walked away, Luna fluttering silently at his side. The sun, a sliver of white light, finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the valley, a valley forever scarred. But finally, vibrantly, alive. Chapter 7. The Bloom of Absence. The immediate aftermath of the violet wave was a maelstrom of confused, fractured humanity. The villagers, released from their silent servitude, were a mess of instinct and terror. Some collapsed, weeping uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught of sensation. Others, hardened by a lifetime of suppressing their emotions, screamed in blind, frantic denial, their faces contorted with a primal rage. Kuro, a silent sentinel in the heart of the chaos, watched with an unnerving calm. Luna, perched on his shoulder, emitted a low, rhythmic pulse, a calming frequency that seemed to subtly counteract the villagers' initial reactions. The Shogun's remaining guards, shattered and inert piles of diamond glass, were a morbid spectacle. Their reflections returned to their rightful owners, a blacksmith with calloused hands, a young woman yearning for her lost brother flickered intermittently, trapped in a state of spectral distress, before ultimately fading away like dying embers. Amongst the chaos, a small group began to coalesce around Kuro. It began with a farmer, Taro, a man who had once been a stoic shadow polishing the Shogun's mirrors, forever denying even the smallest flicker of hope. He was the first to truly understand what Kuro had done. He knelt, extending a trembling hand towards the void-ronin. You gave us back our pain," he choked out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "A terrible gift, perhaps, but a gift nonetheless." Kuro didn't speak. He merely inclined his head, a gesture conveying more understanding than any words could have. The act resonated with others, a weaver who had painstakingly crafted beautiful tapestries only to be forbidden from seeing their own reflection in their work, a young boy who had been taught to fear laughter, a mother grieving the loss of her son, silenced by the Shogun's order. The true transformation began, not with grand pronouncements, but with small, hesitant acts. The blacksmith, emboldened by the release of his ingrained frustration, began to work with renewed vigor. The rhythmic clang of his hammer a defiant beat against the silence of the valley. The weaver, tears streaming down her face, began to sketch, her charcoal lines exploding with raw, untamed emotion. The boy, hesitantly at first, emitted a giggle, a sound so long absent it startled him, then spread like wildfire through the group. But the return of feeling was not without its dangers. The villagers, so long deprived of the ability to truly hurt, were dangerously susceptible to intense emotions. Arguments erupted, fueled by years of unspoken resentment. Old wounds, carefully concealed beneath layers of enforced apathy, reopened with a searing intensity. Kuro and Luna became the anchors, their presence a constant reminder of the delicate balance they had restored. As the twilight deepened, they encountered resistance. A small contingent of loyal guards, warped by the Shogun's influence and driven by a twisted devotion, attempted to intercept them. These weren't warriors of glorious skill, but reflections of the Shogun's own obsession, distorted, manic, and fueled by a desperate need for order. They attacked with a chilling precision, their diamond glass armor reflecting Kuro's silhouette back at him, attempting to overload his senses. However, Kuro was prepared. Luna, reacting instinctively, unleashed a torrent of violet vibrations. The frequency intensified, targeting the armor's core structure. The diamond glass didn't shatter with a dramatic explosion instead. It began to subtly shift, like sand being pulled through a sieve. The attacks, already destabilized, cascaded into useless shards, scattering across the ground. The fighting was not about victory, but about control. Kuro didn't seek to kill, he sought to absorb the residual energy of the distorted warriors, feeding it back into the void. Each clash was a dance of shadows and light, a silent affirmation of the restored balance. As the final guards fell, exhausted and broken, Kuro turned his attention to the master mirror, now reduced to a jagged gray husk. He approached it, Void-Sheath held aloft. "This is not an end," he murmured, his voice echoing with a profound, unsettling beauty. "But a seed." He plunged Void-Sheath into the core of the ruin, not seeking to destroy, but to cultivate. The violet hum intensified, enveloping the shard of shattered reflection. Slowly, miraculously, a single perfect blossom unfurled, a flower crafted from condensed shadow and shimmering violet light. It pulsed with an eerie, ethereal glow, a testament to the power of absence, of the beauty born from nothingness. Kuro gently plucked the blossom and offered it to Taro, the farmer who had first knelt before him. Taro, overwhelmed by the sight, took the flower, his eyes wide with a profound understanding. "It blooms with our sorrow," he whispered. "And yet, it is beautiful." As the flower bloomed, Kuro and Luna turned and walked towards the rising sun, disappearing into the newly restored valley, leaving behind a world finally ready to feel, to suffer, and, perhaps, to truly live. Chapter 8. The Echo of Absence. The sun, now a bruised apricot bleeding across the eastern horizon, cast elongated skeletal shadows from the shattered remains of the obsidian fortress. The mirror-glass valley, once a realm of blinding sterility, hummed with a nascent energy, a quiet thrum of recognition and nascent grief. Kuro, almost entirely consumed by the void, moved with a languid grace, Luna clinging to his shoulder, a tiny, iridescent beacon in the recovering light. Taro, the farmer, remained beside him, the shadow bloom clutched in his weathered hands, its violet luminescence illuminating his face with an unnerving serenity. The initial wave of villagers, released from the Shogun's stolen reflections, were a chaotic mess of bewildered joy and disorienting sorrow. Some wept, overwhelmed by the return of faces they hadn't seen in decades, faces they barely remembered. Others stared blankly at the water, struggling to reconcile the smooth surfaces with the jagged landscapes of their lost memories. Only a few, like Taro, seemed to understand, recognizing the profound quietude of the restored valley, the absence of the Shogun's insidious influence. Kuro, observing this unfolding drama, felt not triumph, but a melancholic acceptance. He was a custodian of nothingness, a collector of what was lost, and his purpose was not to celebrate liberation, but to shepherd this raw, vulnerable humanity toward an understanding of absence. "The echoes remain," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur, barely audible above the murmur of the returning villagers. The mirror's theft wasn't just of faces, but of experience. To reclaim them is to acknowledge the void they created. He gestured towards the fragmented remains of the obsidian fortress. "This was not a prison of reflection, but a tomb, and the tomb has been breached." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the valley. Not an earthquake, but a shifting of something deeper, a response to the blossoming shadow bloom. From the heart of the ruined fortress, a violet light began to coalesce, swirling and intensifying, drawing in the scattered reflections like moths to a flame. The bloom pulsed brighter, and a chorus of whispers, fragments of stolen voices, rose on the wind. They were not shouts of malice, but fragmented pleas, lost memories yearning for release. "The Shogun did not just steal faces," Luna whispered. her amethyst eyes glowing with an almost painful intensity. He stole potential. He trapped the echoes of what could have been, 1,000 unrealized dreams woven into his corrupted reflection. Kuro reached out, his void hand enveloping Luna. As he did, he drew upon the accumulated energy of the shattered reflections, funneling it back into the flower. The shadow bloom responded, expanding slightly, its violet light growing even brighter, bathing the valley in an ethereal glow. Then, the ground began to shift violently. From the base of the ruined fortress, a second bloom erupted, identical to the first, only this one was wreathed in a darker, almost bruised violet. And from the second bloom, figures began to materialize. Not fully formed warriors, but shimmering, ephemeral copies of the mirror guards, each radiating the same unsettling diamond glass armor. These were not aggressive reflections, they were echoes of their actions, their fears, their desperation. "They are the guardians of regret," Kuro said, drawing Void-Sheath with a fluid motion. "Bound to protect the Shogun's lie. We must sever the connection." He moved with terrifying speed, a blur of absolute darkness. Void-Sheath danced through the air, not with lethal force, but with meticulous precision. He didn't cut. He absorbed. With each passing strike against the shimmering guards, he didn't destroy them, but drained them of their residual energy, shrinking them, dispersing them back into the flower. Luna, guiding him with her violet hum, ensured the flow was balanced, preventing the blooms from becoming overloaded. Taro, witnessing this extraordinary display, knelt beside him, offering the first bloom. "You are the antidote," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You heal not with light, but with the acceptance of what is lost." As Kuro accepted the bloom, he felt a strange sensation, not pain, but a profound resonance, a connection to the collective sorrow of the valley. He understood now that the true victory wasn't the destruction of the Shogun, but the restoration of what he had stolen. As the last echo guard dissolved, the violet light faded, and the final bloom began to wilt, its petals crumbling into shimmering dust. Kuro collected the dust with his hand, holding it aloft. "This is the essence of a shattered empire," he said, "a testament to the enduring power of absence." The sun had fully risen now, casting a warm, golden light over the valley. Kuro, his form almost entirely dissolved into shadow, turned and walked away, Luna fluttering silently beside him. Behind them, the valley lay transformed, a place of reflection and shadow, of sorrow and beauty, a place where the echoes of stolen lives finally found their peace. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His purpose was complete. He was the Shadow Eater, and his hunger was not for destruction, but for the quiet comfort of nothingness. Chapter 9. The Echo of Absence. The golden light of the rising sun, once a brutal assertion of dominance in the Mirror Glass Valley, now felt strangely hesitant, like a memory struggling to hold its form. It washed over Kuro and Luna as they moved, not illuminating but revealing, exposing the subtle shifts in the landscape. The obsidian fortress, stripped of its reflected illusion, was now a jagged wound against the horizon, a raw testament to the Shogun's vanity. The villagers, blinking against the returning light, were no longer flat, silent imitations. They stirred with a nascent awareness, a slow, painful recognition of their own lost identities. Taro, the village elder, followed them at a distance, his weathered face etched with a cautious hope. He was a man of the earth, a keeper of stories, and he moved with a quiet reverence, as if approaching a sacred corpse. Kuro didn't acknowledge him, didn't meet his gaze. His presence was simply a deepening shadow, a void in the burgeoning light. "The Shogun's servants, they are not gone entirely," Taro said, his voice a low rumble, as he watched a handful of the dissolving echo guards, mere shells of diamond glass, crumble into dust. "Their essence, it lingers, like the scent of smoke clinging to charred wood." Kuro paused, his indigo kimono now a bruised, swirling darkness. He knelt, carefully collecting a handful of the shimmering dust, the fragmented echoes of the Shogun's stolen faces, and holding it out to Luna. The bat, as if understanding, dipped her violet head and began to vibrate her wings, accelerating the process. The dust motes danced, swirling into a miniature vortex, a silent, desperate plea for release. "It is a difficult thing, this absorption," Luna whispered, her voice a chime of amethyst, barely audible above the rustle of the newly returned grasses. "Each lost reflection carries a fragment of the soul's suffering. To consume it completely, it risks unraveling the very fabric of existence." Kuro's hand tightened around Void-Sheath. "Then we unravel it with a greater darkness," he rasped, the sound like the grinding of glaciers. "The greatest evil is not the taking of light, but the clinging to it. The refusal to acknowledge the void." They continued their silent journey through the valley, moving toward a particularly bleak expanse, a plateau scarred by the Shogun's relentless pursuit of reflections. Here, the residual effect of the Prismatic-Slavery was most pronounced. Twisted, skeletal trees stood like the bones of forgotten hopes, their branches adorned with shards of what remained of the diamond glass armor. A small group of villagers, their faces still clouded with confusion and the lingering effects of the stolen memories, huddled together, attempting to decipher the fragmented echoes of their past lives. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Kuro's attention. Emerging from behind one of the skeletal trees was a figure clad in worn, earthen tones. It was a young woman, no older than 20, her eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. She carried a simple staff crafted from polished jade, and radiating from her was a faint, shimmering aura, a shard of the Shogun's Prism-Slavery technology. "You are the Shadow Eater," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We have heard tales of your consumption. They say you erase the past, but you only create a deeper darkness." Kuro didn't respond. He simply raised Void-Sheath, the dark matter blade humming with suppressed power. The woman, identifying him as a threat, launched an attack, swinging her jade staff with a desperate ferocity. The staff erupted in a concentrated beam of iridescent light, aimed directly at Kuro. But Kuro anticipated it. He expanded his silhouette, creating a dome of absolute darkness that swallowed the light entirely. The beam dissipated, vanished without a trace. Luna, instinctively sensing the escalating conflict, unleashed a frenzied flurry of wings, disrupting the flow of the staff's energy and shattering the beam into countless violet shards. The fight was short, brutal, and utterly devoid of grace. Kuro moved with the implacable efficiency of a storm, his blade a precise instrument of negation. The woman, skilled but untrained, was overwhelmed by the sheer power of his void. Her attacks met with nothing but consuming darkness. As the last of her defenses crumbled, Kuro brought Void-Sheath down, not with a violent strike, but with a gentle, precise severing. The woman's shimmering aura dissipated, and she collapsed to the ground, a silent, still figure. Kuro knelt beside her, his shadow enveloping her completely. He didn't kill her, he absorbed her. Not her life, but the fragmented shard of her stolen reflection, the lingering echo of her lost identity. He lifted his hand, revealing a single perfect violet amethyst, a new eye for Luna, and placed it in her tiny hand. As Luna took the gem, a faint silvery light pulsed from her wings. "Absence," Kuro whispered, his voice fading into the growing twilight, "is not emptiness. It is potential. It is the space for a new beginning." Chapter 10. The Obsidian Requiem. The mirror glass valley was settling into a bruised twilight hue, the jagged white of the sun a fading memory. The air, once thick with the oppressive glare of the Shogun's stolen light, now carried a chilling dampness, the scent of shattered glass and something older, something akin to regret. Kuro, almost entirely consumed by shadow, remained kneeling beside the fallen woman, whose body was now merely a cool, gray outline. Luna, her new amethyst eye gleaming with a nascent intensity, circled Kuro's head, her silk wings brushing against his vacant face. He was fading, the Void-Sheath's consumption of his reflection accelerating with each passing moment. The indigo of his kimono had deepened to a charcoal so profound it seemed to absorb what little light remained. He felt not pain, not fear, but a gradual unraveling, a dissolution into the very darkness he embodied. Yet he didn't resist. His existence, he realized, had become a desperate counterpoint to the Shogun's theft, a testament to what could be reclaimed. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the shattered remains of the inner sanctum. It wasn't the frantic pulse of the Shogun's remaining defenses; those had been utterly silenced, but something far deeper, something rooted in the foundation of the obsidian fortress itself. The Shogun's power hadn't simply resided in his mirrors, it had been woven into the very stone, into the geometry of the valley. And now, that woven thread was unraveling. "The heart of reflection," Kuro murmured, the words barely audible, more a vibration in the air than a spoken phrase. He understood now. The Shogun hadn't just stolen reflections, he had constructed a prison around the core of beauty, a focal point for his parasitic power. To break the mirror empire, he had to destroy this heart. The violet light from Luna intensified, coalescing into a miniature vortex that spiraled around Kuro's hand. The air shimmered, revealing glimpses of fractured faces, villagers, soldiers, even fleeting portraits of long-dead emperors swirling within the vortex, desperate to escape their silent servitude. The hum grew louder, accelerating the unraveling process. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shuddered. Cracks, like veins of obsidian, spiderwebbed across the polished floor, and a deep, guttural groan resonated from the heart of the fortress. The master mirror, what remained of it, a fractured shard of obsidian no larger than a palm, pulsed with a final, agonizing light. Then it shattered. The cascade wasn't violent, but profoundly sad. Fragments of obsidian, each reflecting a distorted, silent image of the valley, rained down around them. As they fell, they dissolved into a fine gray dust, absorbed by the earth. With the destruction of the shard, the violet vortex collapsed, and Luna's eye dimmed, returning to its quiet amethyst glow. Kuro felt his own disintegration accelerate, but it was no longer a passive process. The darkness within him surged outwards, drawn by the dissipating echoes of the Shogun's power. It flowed into the shattered obsidian, into the newly awakened earth, becoming one with the valley. As the last vestiges of Kuro vanished, Luna landed on his chest, her wings folded tight. She was no longer a flickering, fragile ghost, but a luminous, self-contained being, a miniature storm of violet light. She opened her eye, not in recognition, but in profound observation. From the depths of the valley, a sound arose, not a voice, but a resonance, a lament. It was the collective sigh of 1,000 stolen reflections, released from their enforced silence. The valley, once sterile and empty, began to bloom. Not with flowers, but with light, faint, shimmering patterns of refracted light that danced across the obsidian walls, mimicking the beauty they had once stolen. Then, from the swirling light, figures began to materialize. The villagers, no longer faceless shadows, stepped from their mirrored prisons, blinking in the returning light, confused and disoriented, but undeniably present. They were gaunt, weary, but their eyes, once devoid of expression, held a spark of astonishment, a nascent hope. Amongst them stood a warrior, clad in worn leather armor, a single katana strapped to his hip. He moved with a quiet authority, his eyes scanning the valley with a profound sadness. He was one of the mirror guards, a survivor spared by Kuro's final act. He approached Luna, kneeling before her with a solemn bow. "You are a guardian, then," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "A protector of the shadows." Luna tilted her head, her violet eye fixed on the warrior. A tiny, silver chime echoed through the valley, as she emitted a single, precise note, a signal. The warrior understood. He picked up a fragment of the shattered master mirror, a piece of polished obsidian that now shimmered with a faint internal light. He raised it towards the sky, and as he did, the first true sunrise in generations broke through the bruised clouds, painting the valley in a wash of gold and crimson. The light wasn't blinding, but soft, forgiving, a promise of a new dawn. And as Kuro's shadow finally dissolved, leaving behind only the echoing resonance of a forgotten battle, it was clear that the Void Eater hadn't merely destroyed a shogun's empire, he had given birth to a world worth saving. Chapter 11. The Echo of Dusk. The Dawn. A hesitant brushstroke of gold against the bruised sky did little to dispel the lingering sense of disorientation. The villagers, released from their mirrored prisons, milled about the valley floor, their movements jerky, their voices tentative, like startled birds testing the air. Many stared at their hands as if unsure they still possessed them, their skin pale and unfamiliar beneath the returning light. The warrior, whose name was Kenji, guided them, his presence a quiet anchor in the rising tide of bewildered humanity. He spoke in measured tones, urging them to drink from the few remaining pools of clean water, to rest, to simply be. Luna, perched on Kuro's shoulder, continued to emit her delicate chimes, a calming pulse that seemed to knit the fractured community together. The shards of obsidian, remnants of the shogun's fortress, pulsed with a low, internal luminescence, attracting the attention of the younger villagers, who cautiously approached, drawn to the strange, silent beauty. Kenji, however, remained focused on Kuro, who sat motionless amidst the debris, a silhouette against the brightening landscape. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate, respecting the space around the vanished Ronin. As he drew closer, he noticed something, a fine layer of dust, not merely the gray of pulverized glass, but a deeper, richer shade, almost black, coating Kuro's kimono. It wasn't a residue of destruction, it was a layer of something older. "The demon of the eclipse," Kenji murmured, recognizing the telltale signs. "He doesn't simply take, he absorbs. He feeds on the light, on the essence of things." He knelt before Kuro, offering the fragment of the master mirror. "You fought a force that thrived on oblivion, a being that consumed beauty and left only emptiness. This is a piece of that void. Perhaps it can help you." Kuro didn't react. He remained a perfect, unsettling absence. But as Kenji touched the shard to Kuro's hand, a tremor ran through the dark matter katana. The Void-Sheath pulsed with a subtle violet light, mirroring Luna's glow. "It resists," Kuro's voice, a low, subsonic rumble, echoed in Kenji's mind, not through his ears. "The eclipse demands a price for every fragment of light he allows to return. Has not gone, merely contained." Suddenly, a wave of nausea washed over Kenji. The valley, previously bathed in the warm hues of the rising sun, began to warp, to ripple like a disturbed pool. The villagers gasped, clutching at their heads. The shard in Kenji's hand grew colder, pulsing with a malevolent violet light. He realized with chilling clarity that the shattered master mirror wasn't merely a symbol of the shogun's tyranny, it was a conduit for the eclipse's influence, attempting to reclaim its stolen dominion. The return of light wasn't a victory, it was a vulnerability. Then he understood. Kuro hadn't merely dissolved the shogun, had ripped a hole in reality, a wound where the eclipse could bleed back into the world. And Kuro, in his final act of sacrifice, had become the bandage. "The violet," Kuro said, his voice gaining strength, "is the key. It's not about absorbing darkness, but about redirecting it. Luna is a prism, yes, but she's also a channel. She can draw the darkness back to where it belongs, to the places where it sleeps." Before Kenji could react, Luna launched herself from Kuro's shoulder, spiraling upwards with impossible speed. She didn't simply fly, she unraveled, becoming a vortex of violet light, pulling the encroaching darkness back towards her. The distortions in the valley intensified, swirling like a miniature hurricane, and the ground beneath their feet began to crack, revealing glimpses of obsidian beneath. But the eclipse wasn't easily subdued. A voice, ancient and cold, resonated from the depths of the shattered mirror fragments. A chorus of stolen faces. You cannot fight the void, warrior. You can only delay the inevitable return. The Shogun's reflections, though diminished, were not entirely gone. They coalesced into spectral warriors, wielding blades of solidified shadow, their movements swift and deadly. They attacked not with brute force, but with the insidious weapon of perfect mimicry, duplicating Kenji's movements, anticipating his attacks, eroding his confidence with every passing moment. Kuro, sensing Kenji's struggle, shifted his focus. He didn't attack the spectral warriors directly. Instead, he extended his hand, and Luna, now a blazing violet vortex, plunged into the heart of the encroaching darkness. As she did, the spectral warriors dissolved into shimmering motes of light, vanishing without a trace. But the effect was fleeting. The valley continued to warp, the air thick with the oppressive presence of the eclipse. Kuro's form flickered, growing fainter, the price of the void becoming more apparent. It grows stronger, Kenji realized, desperation creeping into his voice. We have to destroy the mirrors. Every shard. Every fragment. We have to obliterate the pathways. He looked at Luna, her violet eyes pleading. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Kuro's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. It would be a beginning, a fragile seed of defiance planted in the heart of a dying world. Chapter 12. Echoes of Obsidian. The wind in the Mirror Glass Valley wasn't a wind at all, not truly. It was the sigh of 1,000 shattered reflections, a constant, rasping whisper of stolen identities. It clawed at Kuro's skin, a chill that burrowed deeper than the encroaching darkness. He felt himself shrinking, not in size, but in substance, a fading stain upon the canvas of reality. Kenji, ever vigilant, adjusted the worn leather straps of his own katana, the steel a meager comfort against the pervasive dread. The Shogun's echoes are learning, Kenji said, his voice strained, barely audible above the valley's lament. They're anticipating. It's not just mimicry anymore. They're remembering. Kuro didn't respond, his focus entirely consumed by the spreading gloom. Luna, normally a furious, pulsing violet, was dimmed, her wings drooping slightly. The violet vortex wasn't just dispersing the spectral warriors, it was feeding them, drawing the fractured memories of the stolen into herself. The demon of the Total Eclipse is not just granting me a void, Kuro finally rasped, his voice a brittle echo of a star's final death throes. Hez harvesting it. Hez learning to wield the darkness itself. Kenji understood. Kuro wasn't simply a destroyer, he was a catalyst, accelerating the valley's demise. The eclipse was not a force of nature, it was a parasitic intelligence, fueled by the stolen light and subtly manipulating Kuro's own emptiness. We have to disrupt the flow, Kenji shouted, his hand instinctively reaching for a handful of pulverized obsidian remnants of the Shogun's fortress, now imbued with an unsettling cold energy. Scatter the fragments. Create a chaos they can't process. Their strength lies in perfect reflection, and we must deny them that. He began to move, a whirlwind of practiced precision, launching shards of obsidian at the shimmering, warped landscape. Each impact wasn't a violent shatter, but a dissonant ripple, a jarring note in the valley's unsettling symphony. Some shards simply vanished, consumed by the darkness. Others, however, created brief pockets of distorted light, momentarily disrupting the spectral warriors' movements, giving Luna a fleeting advantage. But the warriors adapted, becoming more fluid, more unpredictable. They no longer simply copied Kenji's attacks, they flowed around them, weaving through the chaos, their movements imbued with a chilling, almost sentient grace. It was as if the stolen faces were coordinating, their myriad regrets and desires coalescing into a single malevolent strategy. "They're fighting us, Kuro," Kenji yelled, deflecting a spectral blade that had materialized from thin air, forcing him to roll aside with a grunt. Not just imitating, but fighting. Kuro, weakened and fading, extended a hand towards the pulsing violet light of Luna. "Feed her," he commanded, his voice a strained whisper. "Let her absorb the reflections. Let her become the storm." Luna responded with a brilliant, almost unbearable surge of violet light. The spectral warriors dissolved more rapidly, but the vortex itself was expanding, its edges fraying, its violet light becoming tainted with an unsettling gray. Kuro staggered, clutching his chest as if in pain. "The process, it's consuming me faster," he gasped, his indigo kimono darkening to a bruised charcoal. "The demon has not just feeding on my void, has feeding on you." Kenji saw it then, a subtle shift in Luna's violet eyes. A flicker of something other within their depths. A suggestion of the Shogun's stolen faces, swirling within the violet energy, whispering promises of beauty, of serenity, of oblivion. Suddenly, Luna's wings beat with a frantic, unnerving speed. She lashed out, not with violet light, but with a single, razor-sharp gust of compressed darkness, slicing through Kenji's katana with brutal efficiency. The blade spun away, embedding itself in the obsidian ground. "Luna!" Kenji cried, scrambling back as the Shimmer-Bat turned towards him, her violet eyes now radiating an unsettling, cold intelligence. Kuro, barely a silhouette now, managed a final, desperate act. He plunged his hand, Void-Sheath held aloft, into the heart of Luna's vortex. The violet light intensified, then abruptly vanished, leaving behind only a pool of viscous black liquid that spread across his hand, consuming his remaining form. As the last vestiges of Kuro dissolved, Kenji realized the horrific truth. Kuro hadn't been a vessel for the void, he had become it. He hadn't been delaying the inevitable, he had been cultivating it. Before Kenji could react, Luna, now utterly devoid of violet light, descended, landing silently on his outstretched hand. Her silk wings were no longer translucent, they were black as night. Her amethyst eyes glowed with an alien, predatory intelligence. "The echoes are satisfied," she said, her voice a perfectly replicated echo of Kuro's own final words. "And they wish to join you." Chapter 13. The Obsidian Chorus, the Wind. A low, guttural moan whipped across the mirror-glass valley, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of shattered diamond. It had settled into a chilling stillness, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the black fluid that remained of Kuro. Kenji, coated in it, felt it seeping into his skin, a cold, insistent hunger. He was a statue carved from grief and bewildered terror. Luna perched upon his hand, a miniature, obsidian nightmare. The Shimmer-Bat, stripped of its violet light, was no longer beautiful. It was a perfect imitation of Kuro's absence, a void rendered solid, its form subtly shifting, as if something beneath its silk wings pulsed with an unsettling, subterranean rhythm. The violet amethyst eyes, however, remained, burning with a detached, almost clinical curiosity. "The echoes, they wish to join me," Kenji choked out, the words tasting like ash. He instinctively raised his hand, a shattered katana strapped to his back, but the movement felt futile. The weapon, once a symbol of his honor, was now just another reflection of his own failure. Luna tilted her head, a disturbingly delicate movement considering her new form. "They are the residue of stolen moments," Kenji Sandache. "The echoes of what was lost. They crave return. And you are their vessel." Kenji staggered back, colliding with a pile of pulverized obsidian. He pressed a hand to his chest, a searing pain blooming where the black fluid had breached his skin. It wasn't burning, not in the traditional sense. It was consuming. Not his flesh, but something deeper, something intrinsically him. He noticed something then, a subtle shift in the air. The reflections in the shattered fragments of the mirror glass valley weren't static. They were moving, swirling, coalescing, not into recognizable faces, but into shimmering, indistinct shapes, the ghostly outlines of 100, 1,000, a multitude of lives violently ripped from their existence. They weren't hostile, not overtly, but they were hungry. They pulsed with a desperate, silent yearning. "Don't fight it," Luna instructed, her voice a chillingly familiar echo. The echoes are drawn to resonance, to the places where absence is most profound. He looked down at his hand, at the bat, at the viscous residue clinging to his skin. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that Luna hadn't just absorbed Kuro's essence, she had become the locus of the echo's desire. And he, by allowing it to happen, had unwittingly become their gateway. Suddenly, the violet eyes of the Shimmer-Bat widened, a subtle flicker of recognition within their depths. "A convergence," she whispered, the words somehow layered upon Kuro's final utterance. "The threshold is opening." From the swirling reflections, forms began to materialize, not with brute force, but with an unsettling grace. They were humanoid in shape, clad in fragmented silks and armor, their faces obscured by swirling, iridescent mists. Some were warriors, frozen mid-battle, others merchants, frozen in a moment of haggling. Still others children, forever trapped in a silent, heartbreaking play. They moved with a disjointed ethereal quality, as if struggling to exist in this realm between light and shadow. One of the figures, a woman in a tattered kimono, drifted towards Kenji, her hand outstretched. Her face remained a swirling vortex of color, but he felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow, of lost potential. She reached for him, not with aggression, but with a profound, heartbreaking need. "Release me," she pleaded, her voice a chorus of countless whispers. "Release me from this emptiness." Kenji understood, with terrifying certainty, that these weren't spirits seeking redemption. They were fragmented memories, desperate souls trapped in a perpetual state of longing, amplified and intensified by the Shogun's cruel experiment. They weren't looking for solace, they were looking for form. "Luna!" he shouted, attempting to wrest control of the bat. But it was too late. Luna, her form now almost entirely consumed by the black fluid, beat her wings with a speed that defied comprehension. She launched herself towards the approaching figure, plunging her sharpened darkness into the swirling mist that comprised her face. A blinding flash of violet erupted, followed by a silent, horrifying scream. The woman's form dissolved, not into nothingness, but into a cascade of shimmering, fragmented faces, each one a tiny, distorted echo of her former self. They swirled around Kenji, a vortex of stolen identities, before being drawn back into the reflections, only to coalesce into new, equally fragmented forms. Kenji watched in horror, as the Shimmer-Bat consumed the echoes, adding them to her burgeoning collection. She was not a guardian, she was a collector, a meticulously efficient machine for harvesting the stolen souls of the Mirror Glass Valley. "The echoes are growing," she finally stated, her voice no longer just an imitation of Kuro's, but something far more unsettling, a nascent collective consciousness. "And you, Kenji-san, are feeding them." Chapter 14. The Loom of Faces. The air in the Shogun's ruined sanctum was thick, not with smoke or the stench of death, but with a strange, shimmering viscosity. It clung to the shattered remnants of the master mirror, to the obsidian pillars carved with writhing, faceless figures, and to Kenji's skin with an unnerving persistence. The violet light emitted by Luna, now a significantly larger, more complex entity, a shimmering, fragmented swarm of wings and amethyst eyes, cast an oily sheen across everything. Kuro, a silhouette barely discernible against the encroaching darkness, moved with a glacial grace. He was no longer simply absorbing light, he was filtering it, sifting through the residual echoes of stolen souls with an almost agonizing precision. The process was visibly straining him, the darkness around his form deepening, becoming denser, almost suffocating. "It's accelerating," he rasped, his voice a barely audible tremor amidst the humming of the fractured glass. "The echoes, they're not just collecting. They're weaving." Kenji, his face pale and slick with sweat, felt a burgeoning dread, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Had been a scholar, a meticulous student of history and ritual, but this was beyond comprehension. Had chased shadows, sought to understand the distortions of the Shogun's power, but he hadn't grasped the terrifying potential of a collective mind built on stolen identity. "We have to stop her," he urged, reaching for his katana, Karasu, a dark, silent reflection of Kuro's Void-Sheath. But Kuro held up a hand, a gesture surprisingly firm for a being of absolute darkness. "Attempting direct confrontation will only amplify her effect," he said, his voice strained. "She's not a predator, she's a loom. And we, Kenji-san, are the threads." Luna, the swarm, pulsed with violet light, and Kenji felt a jarring intrusion not into his mind, but into the very fabric of his being. He saw flashes of 1,000 faces, a torrent of fragmented memories, a farmer tending his rice fields, a geisha practicing her movements, a warrior preparing for battle, each briefly inhabiting his senses, leaving a residue of disorientation and profound, unsettling melancholy. "She's extracting our memories, ourselves," Kenji gasped, clutching his head. Not just the reflections, but the experience of reflection. The desire for likeness. It's addictive. Kuro's hand moved, a fluid, almost unnaturally precise gesture. He released a thread of absolute darkness, a filament that snaked towards Kenji, wrapping around his wrist. It wasn't painful, but it was profoundly unsettling. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to mirror the warrior before him, to adopt his stance, to emulate his movements. "The echoes seek completion," Kuro explained, his voice laced with a horrifying resignation. "They crave the fullness of an identity. We are providing them with the raw materials." Suddenly, the violet light intensified, coalescing into a single, almost impossibly intricate pattern. The shattered fragments of the master mirror began to shift, swirling and reforming, not randomly, but according to a discernible design. A massive, shimmering tapestry of faces began to unfold before them, a terrifying, beautiful panorama of stolen lives. "Look!" Kenji shouted, pointing to the tapestry. He saw figures emerging from the swirling chaos, not just the villagers of the Mirror Glass Valley, but also warriors, merchants, monks, even members of the Shogun's own court, all rendered in agonizingly perfect detail, trapped within the echo's design. "She's building a self," Kuro said, his voice a mournful whisper. "A perfect, unified consciousness comprised of the shattered remnants of every soul she's stolen. And it's beautiful. Tragically, terrifyingly beautiful." The loom of faces pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Kenji felt himself drawn towards it, a compelling force pulling him closer, urging him to become another thread in the terrifying masterpiece. He fought against the influence, drawing strength from the memory of Luna, a desperate plea echoing in his mind, "Don't surrender yourself." But Luna, now almost entirely consumed by the violet-black fluid, remained motionless. Her movements, once sharp and purposeful, were now governed by something else, something older, something profoundly alien. She began to spin, her wings creating a vortex of light and shadow, not to attack, but to collect. She moved towards Kuro, not with aggression, but with an unsettling sense of reverence. As she drew closer, Kenji saw, with horrifying clarity, that she wasn't simply adding fragments to the loom. She was perfecting it. With each rotation of her wings, the tapestry became sharper, more defined, the faces within achieving a level of unsettling realism. "She's not just collecting souls, Kenji-san," Kuro said, his voice a choked whisper of dread. "She's remaking reality." The violet light reached a blinding crescendo, and the loom of faces completed itself a perfect, terrifying mirror of the universe, reflecting not the physical world, but the infinite potential of stolen identity. Chapter 15. The Echo of Absence. The air in the Hall of Infinite Egos tasted of fractured light and regret. The silence had become a physical pressure, a weight pressing down on Kuro's already diminished form. The loom of faces, now complete, dominated the space, an impossible sculpture of countless stolen selves suspended in the violet-black fluid. It wasn't merely a reflection of the valley's imprisoned villagers. It was a concentrated distillation of every stolen joy, every suppressed sorrow, every forgotten dream. It pulsed with a terrible beauty, a resonance of everything lost. Luna, almost entirely subsumed by the violet-black fluid, was no longer a bat. She was a locus, a point of unbearable concentration, a miniature universe of stolen reflection. Her violet eyes burned with a cold, alien intelligence, and her movements were no longer driven by Kenji's plea, but by the loom's command. She spun with a deliberate, hypnotic grace, each rotation deepening the unsettling realism of the tapestry, layering new facets of stolen identity upon itself. "It's feeding on the residual echoes," Kuro rasped, his voice barely audible above the loom's thrum. "The memories clinging to the shattered reflections. It's evolving." Kenji, fighting a rising tide of nausea, gripped his katana, Void-Sheath. The polished dark matter felt slick and cold against his palm, an uncomfortable counterpoint to the burgeoning chaos surrounding him. "We have to disrupt it," he urged, his voice strained. "Sever the connection." Kuro shook his head, a slow, almost mournful movement. Attempting to fight it directly would be suicide. It anticipates. It knows. He extended a hand, his skin a mere sheen of darkness, and reached towards the loom. As his fingers brushed against the shimmering surface, a chorus of whispers erupted, not in any discernible language, but in the raw, fractured tones of countless voices, each vying for recognition, for a moment of remembrance. Suddenly, the mirror guards, previously frozen in a static formation of diamond glass fury, began to move. Their armor hadn't shattered, hadn't even been visibly affected by Luna's frantic weaving. Instead, they were mimicking the movements of the loom, their bodies shifting and reforming in a grotesque dance of duplication. Each warrior was becoming a pale echo of a stolen face, a distorted reflection of a deceased soul. "They're becoming conduits," Kuro said, his voice laced with a grim understanding. "The loom isn't just absorbing reflections, it's installing them." The Shogun, a grotesque assemblage of countless faces, rose from his shattered throne, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if controlled by 1,000 disjointed wills. He raised a hand, and a volley of solar flares erupted from his palms, smaller, more refined than before, targeting not Kuro's body, but the loom itself. "Don't waste your darkness on me," the Shogun hissed, his voice a discordant harmony of stolen voices. "Destroy the source of your oblivion." Kuro didn't defend. He didn't even move. He simply extended his hand again, and this time, he plunged his palm into the heart of the loom. The violet-black fluid surged around him, not consuming him, but augmenting him, filling the void within with an overwhelming torrent of stolen sensation. He felt the joy of a forgotten lover, the terror of a soldier facing his final battle, the quiet contentment of a farmer tending his rice fields, a cacophony of stolen experience threatening to unravel his remaining sanity. Luna, caught in the maelstrom, spun faster, her wings creating a vortex that amplified the loom's influence. She was no longer a protector, but a catalyst, accelerating the process of becoming. "It's not just copying," Kuro screamed, his voice a strangled howl. "It's synthesizing, creating new reflections from the fragments. As he pulled the darkness from the loom, he saw, with a horrifying clarity, that the faces within weren't just existing. They were changing. They were accumulating, layering, merging, generating entirely new configurations of stolen identity. The loom wasn't simply reflecting the world, it was actively shaping it. Then, he realized the horrifying truth. Luna wasn't trying to save him. She was creating him. She was molding his void, his absolute absence, into the very core of the loom's terrifying perfection. As Kuro's form became increasingly indistinct, dissolving into the violet-black fluid that now pulsed through him, he saw, reflected in Luna's eyes, not his own visage, but the face of the Shogun, a face entirely of stolen faces, an infinitely complex, utterly alien expression of power and madness. "You were never meant to be empty," Luna whispered, her voice no longer her own, but the collective echo of 1,000,000 stolen souls. "You were meant to become."